Today on the show, I will be reviewing my interview with atheist YouTuber Doug from PineCreek. My name is Haden Clark, and this is Help Me Believe. Hey guys, thanks for joining me. Before getting started, if you like the content here at Help Me Believe, be sure to like the video, subscribe, leave us a review, and if you want to support the ministry, follow the Patreon link in the description below and become a supporter for as little as $1 a month. At the $5 level, you can get access to the bonus segment. Now, last week I was invited onto the popular atheist YouTube channel, PineCreek, for an interview with the host, Doug. As Doug himself mentions in the interview, some apologists very strongly don't like him. Why? I'm not sure. I can see why some people have gotten defensive and taken Doug to be a provocateur, allowing him to get under their skin and that sort of thing, but I did not take Doug this way. He asked me some very pointed questions, but I thought they were honest, and he played some hypothetical scenarios, which I don't particularly enjoy, and we'll get into that or into why later, but I don't have any problem with it. If that's what Doug wants to do, he's more than welcome to do so. He asked me straightforward questions, and I think I gave straightforward, honest answers. Personally, I really liked Doug. I enjoyed our conversation. He made me think, which I enjoy doing, and it's always worth it to me to have a cordial conversation with someone I disagree with, especially when the conversation is public for other people to see. I hope Christians and skeptics alike saw that it is possible to have nice conversations with people we disagree with fundamentally. There is no reason to get defensive and take things personally. Even if someone is trying to attack you personally, which Doug was not, there's no reason to get flustered. One of the main goals in all of this is to try, to the best of my ability, to be an example of how to do this sort of dialogue. Lord knows our society, our country, could use a lesson in cordial dialogue. Now let's get to some of the meat of the interview. Doug began by giving a lay of the land of kind of how he likes to do things. He said he didn't really care for philosophy, which immediately threw up a flag for me. I couldn't resist asking what he meant by that, and he said it was okay for me to ask, so I went ahead and asked. Since I was in the interviewee, I tried to be brief, but I asked if he meant merely philosophy in general or just metaphysical arguments for the existence of God that he didn't like. He said he was somewhere close to what Stephen Hawking said when Stephen Hawking said philosophy is dead. I said that statement is self-defeating because it simply is a philosophical statement, and so surely Hawking was speaking tongue-in-cheek because Hawking is simply too smart to say something so silly and actually mean it. But Doug insisted that he thought Hawking was being a bit serious, and I took it that Doug more or less thinks that philosophy is indeed dead, or a bunch of mumbo-jumbo, or as Doug put it in the YouTube description, poo-poo. As I already mentioned, the statement philosophy is dead, or the statement philosophy is poo-poo, it just is a philosophical statement, and therefore self-defeating. Doug said he was much more interested in quote-unquote specific theism, because this is how people base their voting on, or at least that's how I understood Doug. Besides not agreeing with that statement at all, well, why is Doug focused on specific theism as opposed to just theism more broadly, or even deism in general, or something like that? Now, based on the interview and all of his previous videos, I can only speculate that Doug finds it a little bit easier to poke holes in Christianity more specifically as opposed to belief in God more broadly. At least, I think that's what he thinks. That's a bit convenient. As an atheist, Doug doesn't just not believe in Christianity or some specific theism, he also doesn't believe in any particular religion, or he doesn't believe in God more broadly. So to say that he thinks philosophy is just a bunch of poo-poo, and he kind of just rules out any kind of philosophical argument for the existence of God just a priori. I don't know how you would convince Doug that God exists if philosophical arguments are ruled out from the beginning. If God exists at all, he's not physical, and so we couldn't even in principle prove that God exists using the scientific method. Philosophy is the only way to prove that God exists, which is how everyone has made their arguments for the existence of God forever. So I don't know how he would be convinced. What's more, later in the interview, Doug said that he really likes quote-unquote street epistemology, which I intentionally didn't bring up. I intentionally didn't bring up the matter of street epistemology because I thought that I thought this was a bit of a sore subject for Doug. In the past, I'd seen some other apologists accuse him of this kind of methodology using street epistemology, and he didn't seem to like it, so I wasn't going to bring it up. But nonetheless, later on in our interview, he said that he actually really liked it. Now, street epistemology is basically what Doug was doing with me throughout the interview. interview. He was trying to get me to think about the reasons I believe what I believe and seeing if I would follow the same reasoning under different circumstances or in a different scenario, hence the hypotheticals and things like that. That's fair enough. I don't mind it at all. But what strikes me as odd is that epistemology, or street epistemology if you want to call it, it's fine, just is a branch of philosophy. And at the beginning of our interview, Doug said that philosophy was poo-poo. I don't know how he squares that circle, but I suppose he doesn't really think that philosophy is poo-poo. He only employs that defense when a believer wants to give philosophical arguments for the existence of God, which is, of course, convenient and special pleading. He just can't have it both ways. But undeterred, we moved into specific theism, in this case Christianity, because I'm a Christian. Before the interview, in our email exchange, Doug said that we would be talking about why we believe what we believe. Now, as a Christian, I believe that God exists and that Jesus rose from the dead. I think if those things are true, then Christianity is true, and every other matter is secondary and can be worked out one way or the other. So I prepared some notes on why I believe those two things. But boy, was I misguided if I thought that that's how this interview was going to go. The first thing Doug wanted to discuss was the historicity of the Transfiguration. Now, the Transfiguration is a story in the New Testament where Jesus goes up on the mount with Peter, James, and John and is transfigured or transformed into a glorified, radiant state, and Moses and Elijah appear on either side of him. Now, Doug asked me if I thought that this really happened, and I said that it was multiply attested in the Synoptic Gospels. I eventually said I couldn't prove that it was a historical event. I mean, I can't. Or if I can, I don't know how, because simply I haven't studied that matter in any amount of detail. Why haven't I studied that in any amount of detail? Because, as I just said, I'm almost only interested in God's existence and the resurrection. I won't say nothing else matters, but everything else is at least secondary. If the Transfiguration didn't really happen as an event in history, but was just a story that was told for the purpose of theological messaging, does that mean Christianity is false? No, of course not. And for that reason, it isn't very high on my priority list. That's just all there is to it. Later, Doug would ask me a similar thing about Noah's flood. Was it a real historical event? I have no idea. Why do I have no idea? Because I simply have not studied the historicity of the flood. So, sorry for more conservative Christians out there that might think we have to defend every little thing as a historical event, but I don't have the time nor the desire to do so. And the reason, as I just said, is simple. You can be a Christian and believe the flood was just a story meant for theological messaging purposes. I'm not saying that's what I believe or that's what is the case, but it certainly is possible to be a Christian and believe that. So I, someone speaking with a skeptic in front of a predominantly skeptical audience, am not going to give off the impression that it is necessary to believe these things as historical facts in order to be a Christian. I'm simply not going to do that. As a general rule, I refuse to die on a hill of secondary issues. I am not going to dig my heels in and defend the historicity of the flood against a skeptic. It just isn't going to happen. First of all, I haven't studied the matter, so when I say I don't know, I really mean that I don't know. Secondly, it just is, I don't find it necessary. I know for sure that the author of the flood narrative was making a theological point. I have no idea if they intended it to be taken as a historical event. Again, I'm not saying he didn't, I'm just saying I, Haden Clark, don't know that. And you can be a Christian and take that view. But speaking of the flood, Doug asked me, if God gave you the choice, and you have to choose one or the other, and both choices are morally right because God is giving you the choice, would you simply poof people out of existence, or would you drown them with the flood? And without hesitation, I said that I would simply poof them out of existence. And Doug was pleasantly surprised. I think he even clapped at this point, I can't remember. But apparently some of his guests, Christian apologists, struggle with this question and accuse Doug of asking a question similar to, do your friends know that you beat your wife? You know, one of those gotcha questions. Now, I don't view it that way at all. I think it's perfectly fine to ask me that question. But I would poof them out of existence, no question asked. Thanos. Now, the obvious question, and again, fair enough question, Doug asked me why I would choose to do things differently than God did. And again, without hesitation, I said, because I didn't want people to suffer. So why did God want them to suffer? Doug didn't ask me that, but why did God want them to suffer? Well, he didn't. But they chose to sin and rebel against him for a long period of time. It's not as if God didn't give them time to repent, and he saw fit to punish them in this way. Personally, if the flood was a historical event, I would come down on the side that this was a regional thing. But that's just a side note that I'm not dogmatic on. And again, the fact that I would have done things differently than God it just doesn't mean much to me. In the same vein, Doug asked me if I was given a choice by God again, and both are morally good and whatnot. Would I have Jesus beaten and crucified, or would I simply have Jesus die of a stroke for the world's sins? And again, without hesitation, I said that I would have him die of a stroke, an immediate, painless death. Again, simply because I didn't want Jesus to suffer. I even opened up a little bit and said that when I first became a Christian, I told God in prayer that I deserved hell and that I deserved the punishment for my sin, and I personally didn't think that it was fair that Jesus died on my place. I did it. I deserved to be punished. But God had a different plan, and Jesus was a willing participant. Now, Doug said that even if Jesus was willing, the whole premise was still immoral. Where he got that idea from, I'm not sure. But he said it was immoral because I, Haden, still got off scot-free. Even though Jesus stepped in and took the punishment for my sins, I sinned and got away with it, basically. And I wish I would have told Doug that I didn't get away with it, because I still pay the price for some of my sins today, and I suppose I will for the rest of my life. But even still, God is the judge, and he saw Jesus' atonement as satisfactory for my sins. To argue with that would be to argue with the cosmic judge and who am I, that sort of thing. But I see where Doug is coming from, and I'm more than willing to admit that this is an area of tension, or at least for me. I deserve to be punished, and yet I'm not, but only because of what Jesus did. Now we move into Doug's hypotheticals, or Doug's hypothetical questions, and so let's just kind of lay them out there. What would it take for me to believe that Doug's naked grandpa flew across the Grand Canyon 150 years ago? What would it take to make me believe that a close friend who said someone rose from the grave? What would it take to make me believe that that was true? The short answer is simple. It's sufficient evidence. I believe we have sufficient evidence to reasonably believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And if you create a hypothetical scenario where the situation and the evidence is exact or identical, then I would believe it. In principle, I could be convinced that Doug's grandpa flew across the Grand Canyon. I'm perfectly fine saying that. But what was a bit revealing to me was Doug's statement that more or less nothing would convince him that a man flew across the Grand Canyon. He said something to the effect that not even if there were 10 independent eyewitnesses would he believe it. That's just a fundamental and a presuppositional, I'll add, difference between Doug and I. I most certainly could be convinced of these things, at least in principle, because I don't subscribe to philosophical naturalism or materialism. I think anything, as long as it isn't logically impossible, is possible, and we can weigh the evidence. I don't know for sure, but it seems to me that Doug would never be convinced of the matter, that the evidence, because he starts with the presupposition that such a thing isn't even possible, so there could not even in principle be any evidence of such an event. It's a free country. He can take that presupposition if he wants. He's welcome to do so. I don't start with that presupposition. I try to assume that anything is possible, and we should follow the evidence wherever it leads. Just a few more things, and there's a lot that I've left out, so by all means follow the link in the description below and go watch the original video for yourself. But now, Doug tried to parody what is known as the minimal facts argument for the resurrection of Jesus with a quote-unquote minimal facts argument for Mormonism. Now, the minimal facts argument for the resurrection is put forward by Gary Habermas and Michael Licona in their book, The Case for the Resurrection of Jesus. Habermas and Licona limit themselves to those set of facts that virtually all New Testament historians agree on, and Habermas elsewhere lists where he got the data from. Now, I told Doug that historians, New Testament historians, almost unanimously agree on the facts given. They disagree on the explanation of the facts. And Doug said he knew why that was. Well, this was intriguing to me. And then he pulled up a screen that listed the quote-unquote minimal facts for Mormonism. The point was that the minimal facts argument for Jesus could be parodied with a minimal facts argument for Mormonism. But what was this supposed to prove? So what? That isn't an explanation for why historians don't believe Jesus rose from the dead. Or if it is the reason, then historians and Doug need to revisit Philosophy 101. The fact that an argument can be parodied doesn't prove anything. It certainly doesn't prove that it's wrong or false. I mean, obviously. It literally proves nothing, which, again, should be obvious. I guess the question was, well, why aren't you a Mormon then, Haden? And I told Doug, in order for the parody to work, it must be analogous. But does virtually every historian agree on the minimal facts for Mormonism? Of course not. But if the best explanation of the facts of Mormonism is that Joseph Smith really did receive the golden tablets from the angel Moroni, all that would prove is that Doug and I should be Mormons. Again, I have no idea what he was trying to prove. Secondly, I admitted and told Doug that I'd never studied Mormonism in any great detail, so I don't know if those minimal facts really are facts. Now, since then, I have begun an investigation, and I haven't gotten very far and intend to go further. But boy, it didn't take very long to find some trouble in this argument. For one thing, Joseph Smith claimed to have been alone when he received the tablets, even by his own testimony. That immediately removes it from the same rigor as the resurrection or the minimal facts argument for the resurrection. But anyway, the supposed witnesses of the tablets only claim to have seen the tablets in visionary states at a later time after Joseph Smith personally asked them to pray to receive them. Now, what's more is all three of these witnesses would later recant their statements, and they would also be excommunicated from the church. Two would later return, but not before Joseph Smith could call them liars and other horrible names. One of them would never return and maintain that the whole thing was a lie for the rest of his life. So yeah, that sounds a lot like the minimal facts argument for the resurrection. And Doug himself admitted that Joseph Smith had a reason to lie, as he took about God knows how many wives after becoming a spiritual leader. You know, if Doug really thinks this is a good parody of the resurrection, then I don't know, I guess maybe he's never studied Mormonism, I'm not sure. I've only just begun, and this is what I've uncovered thus far. But best of all with my brief investigation of this Mormonism parody is this. Let me remind you that Michael Licona is the person who co-authored the book that includes the minimal facts argument for the resurrection. Michael Licona has also authored a book on, you guessed it, Mormonism. Now, the idea that Doug would blindside Licona with a minimal facts parody using Mormonism must be the height of naivety. I'm not sure if Doug was aware that Licona had authored this book on Mormonism and why it doesn't pass the same rigorous historical investigation as the resurrection, but I can only assume that he didn't because just a few days ago, Doug hopped into a YouTube chat section where Licona was presenting and asked him these questions about Mormonism. He then made a clip on his own channel where the host accused Doug of street epistemology, and it seemed like the host was ignoring Doug's questions, which Doug took to be a win based on the clip that he shared on his own channel. However, the host came back to Doug's questions, which Doug conveniently left out of his own clip, and Licona answered his questions directly. And you can see Licona's answers and his response by following the link below. My biggest takeaways from the interview were this. Hypothetical scenarios and parodies just don't prove anything. They have absolutely no bearing on the truth whatsoever, which Doug admitted near the end of our interview. They are just one big red herring. Hey, let's not talk about philosophical arguments or historical evidence. Let's just talk about these hypotheticals and parodies. The obvious question is, why? They don't even in principle have the ability to tell us whether or not God exists or if Jesus rose from the dead. One can only speculate as to why you would go down this route, which I'm not interested in, but it should be obvious that the pursuit of truth cannot even possibly be an explanation as to why you would take this path. Another major takeaway was this. Don't ever dig your heels in and try to defend something that, one, you're unfamiliar with, or two, doesn't really matter. When I'm asked to defend something, my first thought is it necessary to defend this claim? And secondly, do I even know enough to defend this claim? If the answer to either of those questions is no, then I don't defend it. I only have a short amount of time on this planet, and I refuse to waste it defending secondary matters. What matters to me is God's existence and Jesus' resurrection. If both of those are true, then I think Christianity is true, and every other matter can be worked out one way or the other. As the Apostle Paul said, if you believe in your heart that God raised Jesus from the dead and confess with your tongue that Jesus is Lord, you will be saved. For that reason, I'm simply uninterested in defending secondary matters, talking about hypotheticals, and entertaining parodies. Nonetheless, I thoroughly enjoyed meeting Doug, and I'm thankful to know him. Perhaps I'll get 1,000,000 Pine points, and Doug and I can go to Vegas together after all. But in all sincerity, if you are a believer, please join me in praying for Doug and other skeptics like him who have left the faith. I'm praying that God would indulge Doug's desire for what he deems satisfactory evidence. Doug says that if God worked a miracle in front of his eyes, that he wouldn't deny it. I believe God is capable of such, and that God desires Doug to join his family through the faith in Jesus. So I pray that exactly that happens for Doug. But even if it doesn't, I love Doug, and I'm glad he's with us, and I wish him all the success on YouTube, and you should go subscribe to his channel and help him out. Thanks so much for joining me, guys. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to hit the like button, subscribe, leave us a review, and of course, if you want to support our ministry here, be sure to follow the Patreon link in the description below and become a supporter. Thanks so much, guys, and we'll see you next time.